Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out to my very first NORWAC lecture. Today, I'm going to be talking about the intersectionality of astrology. My goal is to somehow pay attention to the chat and present all the information to you, and also leave about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the lecture for Q&A. Spoke with Palace, who's going to be checking the chat and also feeding questions to me as we go along. But before I get started too much, I do want to thank NORWAC and thank Laura again, in particular, for noticing this lecture, this content that I presented first in 15 minutes at Astrologer back in 2018. The Organization for Professional Astrology hosted that retreat in Tucson, Arizona. So the first time I presented this talk, I closed with this quote, but I wanted to open with this quote in part because I knew I was going to be really nervous and because it really speaks to the importance of speaking up when we are most nervous, and also to acknowledge that I am hardly the first person to think about intersectionality or the importance of examining multiple ways that we are impacted by the environment around us. So I'll speak this for those who are listening to the recording. We have been socialized to respect fear more than our own needs for language and definition. And while we wait in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of that silence will choke us. For it is not difference that immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. I know that I am not the first person to bring an intersectional lens to my astrological practice, but so far as I've heard, maybe the first person to present this particular topic in a large conference format. So I want to acknowledge that there are folks like Jessica Lanyado and Channing Nicholas who have been doing this work for a long time before, and I'll be shouting out a lot of other folks throughout this particular lecture. So to begin with, there are three kind of questions or phrases I want to throw out there to you that got me thinking about this question. Where does intersectionality show up in astrology? So you're exactly where you need to be. It's a spiritual truism, depending on your particular event, your own faith and practice. Or maybe it isn't, and that's not really the point. It's something that we often reach to say because it might be comforting or soothing to our clients, maybe to ourselves or to our friends. But in my experience, particularly somebody who inhabits many intersections, and I'll speak more to that, this can sting, particularly for women, for people of many different colors, for indigenous folks, for queer people, for folks who are marginalized in other ways as well. When you find yourself experiencing oppression or microaggressions, being told that you're exactly where you need to be often causes more harm than good. Some faces to look at. And then this question, should astrology be political? It's one I've seen floating around in astrological conversations and Facebook groups, things like that. And it's a question that, it's obvious that we would all come to this. And I've heard and read some folks contend adamantly that politics has no place in astrology whatsoever. One of the things that we'll explore today is the way in which astrology has always been quite political. And then, can everything be seen in the chart? In the last 2 years, I've explored quite a few different schools of thought astrologically. And as I've learned Hellenistic technique and horary technique kind of through the lens of William Lilly, and explored astrological thought from quite a long time ago and a very long time ago, I've seen that many astrologers look at astrology and what it can do as though everything can be seen in the chart. And those who don't certainly think that we can see preeminence, opportunity, ascent, governance, rulership, all of these things that occupy a position of dominance or supremacy in our culture, but not then are marginalized or non-normative identities or experiences. So I wonder if that isn't in part because it's not particularly warm and fuzzy stuff to think about, and also if it isn't because it requires us to examine and question our positions of privilege in a way that is challenging. But I'll talk some more about why we maybe don't see everything in the chart. Before I get too much further, I want to talk about Saturn, Saturnian stability. So the first time I presented this lecture, I said, definitely for sure, I know that we can take the significations of the planets and apply our intersectional lenses to get some useful information about how we can host a webinar, a lecture, a conference, a retreat, teach our classes, or inform our clients in a way that creates more accessibility, more belonging, and more inclusion. And so one of those things, Saturn, obviously, we got to have a foundation. We got to have a container. We got to have some sort of shared definitions, some rules, some ground rules, if you will, so that we can all come together on an equal footing to actually partake of the knowledge that we want to share. So if we were in person, this would be really important since none of you can unmute yourselves. I know that one diva, one mic, easily covered. But in an in-person environment, I think it's really important that we always begin with ground rules. And that's a product of my experience and training as a young activist. So before I get too much further, I guess I should introduce myself a bit for those of you who don't know me. I'm Ryver. I am located on the west coast of the States. Right now, I live in occupied and unceded Ohlone territory, and my folks hail from the Tanana Valley. I'm myself an indigenous, obviously coded and read as Black in society, and that is part of my ancestry. And I also have a whole lot of European colonizing ancestry, and I'm queer, and I'm trans. And all of those things put me at a lot of intersections of intersections. That's part of why this has been so important to me, and that's part of how I landed in a position as a youngster, 13, 14, working with GSA Network, the Gay Straight Alliance Network. Through that activism, peer facilitation primarily, but a youth empowerment organization that really focused on putting queer youth, and especially marginalized queer youth, in a position of leadership to share our knowledge and also advocate for ourselves. So my grounding in intersectionality is very grassroots and experiential. It's not particularly academic, although I will do my best to perform some citationality for everybody here today. So these ground rules come out of my own experience as a young person. That's why it's respect and one diva, one mic. Step up, step back, and not things like, please don't talk over one another. I statements, but that last one I think is the most important, particularly for anybody who is exploring intersectionality for the first time. There are a lot of stages that we'll go through in our own political awakening and in the process of applying that understanding to our practice. And the first might be as simple as taking responsibility for your impact, as opposed to using your intention to deflect from making reparations or repair with those that we might have harmed. Because one thing that I'm fairly certain is true is that, well, I know it's true, every single one of us is a product of our culture, which means if you are an American, you're a little bit racist, you're a little bit sexist, you're a little bit a lot of different isms, because that is our culture. Now, that doesn't mean that you are a bad person. This isn't a moral judgment. And when I talk about privilege and power, these aren't statements that belong to the category of value judgments. These are descriptive statements about the way our society is organized. I'm gonna try to pop into the chat and see if I can follow that as I go along. But now I'm gonna give up on it. Palace, if there's anything excellent in the chat, please let me know.
You're getting so many hearts and so many yeses and so many cheers. Yeah, excellent. You're good.
Everyone's with me. So I feel like these ground rules, I'll read them for the recording. Respect, one diva, one mic. That means don't talk over people. Confidentiality, obviously, as counseling astrologers, that's a fundamental bedrock of our practice. Step up, step back means if you're marginalized, if you're shy, if you're quiet a lot, if you don't like to speak up in a group, every once in a while, step up. But it also means and requires of those of us who constantly step up or who are positioned in the front to step back. So in a group dynamic, if you're super duper extroverted and you always have something to say, like, shh, just for a second, let somebody else speak. But most importantly, if you are privileged, and many of us will occupy lots of different positions of privilege depending on the context. If you have privilege, it's important to step back and allow those who are marginalized, particularly along that same axis space to step up themselves. Okay, so here we go. a roadmap. This is what we're going to cover, and I'm going to try to cover the first three in about 45 minutes. What is intersectionality? I want to make sure we all understand this concept as it exists in the socio-political world, and particularly as it exists coming out of the legal world.
Fair.
Yes?
Daniel asked, can you talk more about what confidentiality means in this virtual recorded context?
So in this virtual recorded context, that's a great question, Daniel. When I first presented this talk, I mentioned confidentiality before I outed myself as a queer person and as a trans person. And in this particular virtual context, that means that I'm placing a lot of trust in everyone's sense of confidentiality, but also opening this to obviously public sense, public forum. But in the context of this specific forum, I would say that means for those who might have questions, if there's a question you want to remain confidential, save it until after the recording so that it's not shared publicly, or feel free to reach out to me, DM me, email me, I'll provide information towards the end. And then in the context of what might be shared here, don't divulge it in a way that names anybody or makes anybody easily identifiable. If you want to name me specifically, I've obviously put that information out for you. But if somebody else were to share their gender identity, their sexual identity, anything else about their personal experience, I would want for everybody here to, if speaking to that is useful to the conversation of intersectional astrology, to do it in a way that anonymizes that person. Does that make sense? Yes, yes, I love you head nodding people. So we'll get into some working definitions. That way we're all on the same page. I think that's really important, right? That's Saturn, so that everybody can access the learning. That's our Jupiter, right? And then I'll go through three graphs. This is what my brain has been mulling over for the last 2 years. And then I'll give you a couple of examples. I want to say right now that I'm not going to give you a framework for how you can see a marginalized identity on the chart. If that's possible, that's a lot of research that I won't be doing alone, and it's not done yet. And if it's not possible, then we don't need to talk about that. And I also want to say that this talk itself is an invitation. Initially, this talk, when I gave it in 2018 in Tucson to OPA, I called it a call for intersectional astrology. And in the last 2 years, I've seen so many folks from so many different identities step into the astrological world, and now I feel like it's not a call for intersectionality. It's more like a ringing the bell to find who wants to do some research with me, and to just put it out there so that the world knows that this is happening. And then the last thing that I can't totally see, probably says Q&A and discussion, so we can move it along. An explanation. What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is initially a lens of legal analysis. It's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is pictured here, in 1989 in her article, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. This was published by the University of Chicago, 1989. You can find it online through Chicago Unbound. Now, I cite this specific work to do something that I learned as a youth peer facilitator, which is to show, not tell, to demonstrate the praxis as the instruction, right? So many different things that we could learn just from this alone. Citationality, specifically in the context of citing Black women, right? There's a hashtag out there, hashtag cite Black women. But also to speak to the fact that intersectionality is very specifically in its origination, Black feminism. And as somebody who is identified as Black, but who has Indigenous heritage, that's my matrilineal line is Indigenous, and that's how we track family ancestry, right? So as somebody who is maybe not Black in the same way, to keep it simple, and definitely as someone who's very obviously not a woman, it is fundamental and imperative that I cite Kimberly Crenshaw, not just because it's her work, but especially because she is a Black woman and I am not. I don't seek to represent myself as somebody who can speak for everyone, just somebody who happens to be in so many intersections that I can feel for everyone, if that makes sense. So I start there because that lens and the article itself is very specifically about 3 legal cases that demonstrate the way in which the legal decisions and precedents in the US essentially erase the existence of Black women because they posit that in order to experience discrimination as a woman, you must not also be experiencing racism. And in order to experience protection from the law in terms of your Title VII protections, right, the Civil Rights Act, in order to receive those protections, you must not have conflicts of interest in your case, which means if you are a Black woman, you must choose, is this sexism or racism that I'm experiencing? And if you read the article, you'll find that in each of the cases Crenshaw analyzes, there's a slightly different reasoning, which creates a slightly different precedent for the erasure of the experience as Black women, and particularly protection under the law. And I really want to emphasize that because when I talk about power and privilege, I'm talking about society, I'm talking about social systems, I'm talking about systemic issues. While on the individual level, these things still exist. For the purposes of our talk, I want to keep it in the public sphere. And I also want to encourage everyone to check out Crenshaw's work. You can just YouTube her. She's given recent TED Talks about the subject. Now, I say this, and my citation is kind of weird, right? 2001, 2007, these groups in this area. But as I said before, that is as accurately as I could cite my personal experience and the transmission of the knowledge that I've received in the context of intersectionality. And as I learned it, it was way broader, way more broad. An individual's relative position on the continuums of power and privilege, right? So we're not talking just about Black women in the way that racism and sexism intersect to systematize public violence against Black women. I think that would be doing justice to the way that Crenshaw would say it. But that it affects actually everybody, right? Being queer and wealthy and white is not the same thing as occupying a position of total normativeness. But I have some graphs that I think will explain this a bit better. So sex, class, race, that's the critical theory trio: gender studies, critical theory, race studies or ethnic studies. In the academia sense, if you start with critical theory, you'll get to a lot of articles and works that deal with this subject. And the first thing that we can think about, just looking at that set of intersections, the way that identity in society is described by the midheaven, the way that we are seen, right? The way that we are coded. Though my heritage, my cultural experience, my family of origin is indigenous, my experience in society will always be as a Black man, even if that wasn't the family environment that I had. That's one way in which you might say that intersectionality can be seen in the midheaven. How is someone's identity filtering what they're seeing, how they are seen, how they're identified in society. And then we can also say, if Saturn is our boundaries, Saturn defines who's inside, who gets protection under the law, who's in the group, who's outside of the group, who's marginalized and who's not. All right, so working definitions. We're going to talk about politics. We're going to talk about power, privilege, oppression, disenfranchisement. Is there another word there? I have to move the bar of people to find out. No. So political. This is taken from etymology.com. It's derived from Aristotle's Politics. The word polis, it's Greek. It means related to or concerning the city. A few little notable things about the word political. Up until the 1550s, it just meant like stuff about the city. 1550s, now it means stuff concerning the citizens, the state, the administration of government. And by the 1750s, it's not a cool thing to be called anymore. So power, in a mechanical sense, is the ability to exert force. In a socio-political sense, we might say it's the ability to influence your outcomes or your environment. Normally, I'd give this intersectionality 101 talk in about 90 minutes, and I try to do it 15, so bear with me. Two things we want to note about power. It's a continuum. There are very few people who just entirely have it or entirely don't. On an individual level, we'd say it's your ability to influence your environment. But on the bigger level that we're concerned with, where we get our isms from, we're talking about power in the context of society, the ability to influence or control social institutions. That's really important to some later points. So privilege. We really want to underscore that privilege is not a value statement. It describes whether or not the reward you were given, the access you were given, is a direct result of your actions or a result of something other than your actions. So the best I could come up with to fit on a PowerPoint slide was access to power granted for reasons other than a direct consequence of your behavior, of your awesomeness. If I, let's say if I am a literacy tutor and I get my 4th grade student who's at a 1st grade reading level up to grade level by the end of the year, and someone does something nice for me, we might, if you take just desserts as being, if you grant just desserts, then you would say I definitely deserved my reward. I did a good thing. If I simply showed up and had somebody facilitate my position at work, my position in school, maybe because my parents have access to that job or that institution, then we would say that I didn't do anything, like my parents did that, ergo I have some privilege there. But another important point, and I think for us astrologers, this is really vital. It's the ability to define what is normal, what is normative. The way that we define significations of planets may unintentionally exclude people from being visible in their chart. So disenfranchisement, this again, etymology.com, erosion or deprivation of civil liberties, right? So in Crenshaw's article, right, demarginalizing the intersection of race, she argues that in each of those cases, DeGraff and Reed, I'm not gonna try to pull it, DeGraff and Reed is the keyword, and if you look at the article, you can find it all there. Crenshaw argues that in each of those cases, the law, the interpretation of existing precedents of the Civil Rights Act itself, and the 14th Amendment, notably, actually align to systematically disenfranchise Black women from equal protection under the law, from their civil liberties, right? Disenfranchisement is systematic barriers to participation in, or that's not systematic barriers to participation in, or participation in or protection from your social institutions, or you could also say systematic and systematized oppression, right? Sorry, we want to talk about disenfranchisement because when you make disenfranchisement institutionalized, when you systematize it, you oppress a whole group of people. So systematic disenfranchisement based on group membership or status. When we talk about our isms, when we're talking about transphobia or homophobia, we're talking about, in Crenshaw's case, an interpretation of the law that renders a specific group of people based on being a member of that group in or out. So we can consider here, it's actually thinking about this all weekend, right? In Mark Jones and his pre-conference lecture, he spoke about early childhood development, right? How early childhood development, particularly getting touch and affection, care from your primary caregiver in those first 18 months of life, first 2 years of life, fundamentally shape the way our personhood develops. So if we're thinking about oppression, we're thinking about systematic disenfranchisement, we would think then that maybe you see that in the IC and the nadir or in the moon, right? The way that the conditions or the relationship that our parents or our caregivers had to power and privilege is going to affect the environment that our first 5 happens in. That's going to be seen in the chart, I would think. So I wanted to throw this in so we could ground this and ground my claim that astrology has always been political and some really old stuff that East Valens. I'm not going to read every single word on this slide. It includes every word in the first 2 pages of his anthologies that relates to government. So you have things like kingship, authority over the masses, the master, noble people, rule over the country, the queen, serfs and farmers, renters of property. So I think our 4 Valens here is actually seeing class also. It's there. We could also mention here that the earliest astrology was coming out of courts. We want to look at things like the founding of Baghdad being a state-sponsored election. early astrology was definitely related to the political sphere around it. And especially if we pull back to political, just meaning concerning the people in the city or state, then definitely we've got a lot of politics in our charts. Okay, so I said heuristic in my description of this lecture, and so I thought I should maybe explain what a heuristic is. It's a method or technique to help somebody in their own self-discovery, problem solving, or learning of a certain bit of information. So in this sense, for me, the heuristic of intersectionality is, what are the different ways that a person is identified? How is that seen by people around them? And how does that influence their ability to move around, access institutions, exert their power? And do they or don't they have privilege? Are they or are they not defined as normal or normative? Okay, so that brings us to our graphs. I think we are doing really well on time. Okay, so to expand our critical theory trio, sex, race, class, we could really zoom out and we could just say that there's power, there's privilege, and there's this third thing. I don't know if you would find this in critical theory literature. I don't know if this is grounded in academia. To my knowledge, I thought of this myself. There's also access, right? Although privilege might define the way that we are granted access, irrespective or because of our membership in a certain group, right? That doesn't totally tell the whole picture. So for me, my family, I was raised by my indigenous family, but all of my indigenous family are white passing. And my experience of interfacing with social institutions definitely doesn't fit with the experience that you would think I have from looking at me. And I think that's because a lot of my early access to institutions was actually filtered through my mom, who, though she is native, looks white. So you can have some types of sideways access to power or privilege, well, to power at least, and to institutions. The access to institutions is the thing I really want to talk about. And that's something that NORWAC is actually a great example of what I would hope to see many organizations do, which is to really zero in on that heuristic, right? Let's look at access. Who has access? Does everyone have access? NORWAC has done a really good job of making sure to increase accessibility of the conference itself. All right, and so if we have power, access, and privilege on the other side of privilege, we would have marginalization. You're not privileged and normative, you're not normative, you're outside the group. You don't have access, you're disenfranchised. You don't have power, you're disempowered. Now, I think the disempowerment is where astrologers have the greatest power to use our magic for good. Now, here's another one. I'm going to move everybody so I can see the bottom of the slides. Future belonging, internal on one side, external alienation and the past on the other. I think this is what we do in our consultations. I think this is our heuristic, right? Does my client want to know about their future, their past? Does my client want to talk about the ways in which they are seeking or moving towards belonging? Or is my client in a moment where they are very alienated and they need recognition, acknowledgement, care, reparation in that area, repair in that area? Are we going really external? Are we like describing the circumstances of their alienation? Are we going very internal? Are we getting into the somatic experience of their conditions? We'll come back to this. I don't want you to hold this one in your mind. I'll come back to that one. That's in the wrong place. This is the thing that I have been just pondering for the last 2 years and studying everything that I can get my hands on to get to. It wasn't until I was really fortunate to receive a study stipend from AFAN, the Association for Astrological Networking, last year, and I was able to take Chris Brennan's Hellenistic course and his electoral course. And I also studied with STA, the School of Traditional Astrology, in their Horary Practitioner course last year. And in putting these pieces together with the kind of the stuff that I think a lot of us have as our entryway, modern psychological astrology, EA, which has always fascinated me personally, putting all these together, I started thinking, maybe astrology as a practice, every single type of discipline, we can fit into this same framework. Are we looking at a macro level? Are we talking about mundane things? And on that macro level, are we acknowledging systems of power? Are we acknowledging where our privilege, or where an example's privilege, or where who we include in our significations and our astrological work defines who is or isn't normative, right? There's our macro. Our micro, if we're down at the client level, are we acknowledging our client's reality? Are we telling them they're exactly where they need to be when they're describing an experience of sexism, right? One example that I like to use, there is a certain woman that I know who has an exalted Mars in Capricorn in the 5th house. It's all configured to the midheaven and the exalted moon. You'd think this would be fantastic. Now, Mars exalted. This woman's really powerful. She doesn't take shit. Sorry, I forgot to tell people I might cuss. Not very much, but I do drop a few in there. Now, this woman can do Mars really well. And you would think that it would be great to tell her, do your Mars, do it hard. However, if you are looking at our society, it is often dangerous for women to do Mars that way, depending on the institution. Because I can't provide the best container to really go deep into these hard spots, I want to be sensitive to not go too deep into them. But I do also want to convey how important it is and how easy it is to not maliciously or intentionally erase your client's experience in the very process of talking to them about their chart. But we want to get to these other two axes. So our x-axis, description or storytelling. I need to look at my little note here. This is our axis of narrative, maybe you want to say. Are we doing like in 1492, X happened, Y happened, and then in 1493, this happened? It's simply describing the events. That's cool, that's okay. On the other end, very, very different. If we're working with storytelling, maybe reframing narratives to help our clients access more legibility of their own identity, access more empowerment. We probably don't want to be super harsh and descriptive. This happened, that stuff, Saturn's there, bad news. And then this Z-axis, the Z-axis, are we directing or are we predicting? I think that's how it works, but I would love, and I invite any of you to talk to me about this if it needs refining or tweaking. But I think there's this axis of description, right? I forgot I made slides for that. So there's this axis that has to do with the way we are attempting to direct or influence our environment. And I think that this relates to intersectionality in a way that we can really use as astrologers. So macro, micro, that's our y-axis, if I remember my schooling. And we're talking about scale. So to what extent does the impact of race, class, or gender at the macro level reflect our client's experience on the micro, our experience on the micro, our organization's experience or mission on the micro? And then this narrative, right? Whose story are we telling? Who are we telling it to? It's okay if our story is about us, about one experience, one group. It's okay if you're an American to do mundane astrology that's about the US. But speak to it. Say, this is about the US. It's where I'm from. I know this place. This isn't inclusive of everybody's experience in the world. Right? So which models or reference do we use when we're relaying our significations? The moon is my favorite example. In my native culture, like, we don't have a gender term, right? It's not a gendered word, for one. Many cultures, it's brother moon. One person on Twitter I failed to include them in this particular slide, but I think I'd love to find their information and share it. Mentioned that in Hindi, I believe, the word for moon also relates to the word for uncle, right? The moon isn't always feminine. It's cool if your framework has the moon being one gender or the other, but speak to it, right? That's my suggestion there. And that's what I want us to think about if we're trying to apply an intersectional framework to our astrology. And then when it comes to influence, do our predictions include folks from many different intersections of experience? Jessica Lendato has done a really good job of using her platform to point out that if we're making hunky-dory predictions because Jupiter's here, that clearly isn't including families who are in detention, right? So who are we talking about? Whose experiences are we talking about? And are we really looking at what is possible? Or as Jen Zart mentioned in her astrolocality lecture, if somebody doesn't have the means to travel or to emigrate, don't talk to them about the great line in another country. Talk to them about how they can bring that food, that language, that music into their lives to connect to that planet, right? So the three of them together, side by side, as close as I could get, in a way that I think everyone can see and read. All of these things, I think, are descriptive of what we're doing, descriptive of how astrology is organized in terms of the many different schools of astrology. I think it describes the world we live in. So if we put these three things together, then where do we see oppression, marginalization, a lack of opportunity in a chart? Is it just in the way that we interpret it, or is there something in our significations that we could include? Another way to put those three things together. Are we attentive when we do our mundane astrology, the systems of power? And are we speaking to the future in a way that is empowering? When we're looking at directing things, influence, I'd say like astro magic, right? With our electional practices, are we attuned to the way that access impacts our client's ability to get that talisman, get that magical materia? Are we including examples of accessible materia? Austin Coppock is doing a good job of speaking to multiple different levels of things that we could seek, right? There are a lot of astrologers who I see is doing this in some way, maybe unintentionally, in some very deliberately, but they're just not trying to give you a lecture about it today. I forgot on the last one, storytelling. Are we acknowledging the privilege that we have in our storytelling? In my culture, storytelling is sacred. It's a really big responsibility to get into somebody's narrative, their understanding of who they are, the world that they live in, and how it works. I think that it takes all kinds, it takes all folks, however you're supposed to say that saying. So I wanted to be really clear, this lecture is not a subtweet. I'm not atting anybody, not calling out anybody, but I'm suggesting that it's imperative and it's incumbent upon us as astrologers to understand when we're getting deep into somebody's internal psyche, soul, whatever we call it, that we acknowledge the privilege that we're exerting, the way that privilege shapes their experience, because I think when we speak to that, we can empower our clients and give them access to a lot of things. But I'm going to get to that in my examples. Alice, how am I doing on time?
We are at just 10 after 3, so you have 40 minutes.
What? Okay, I'll pause for a moment then. Does anybody have questions? Are there comments that I should speak to or know about?
The entire chat is incredible. I feel like if we were in person, you would not be this far in your lecture because there just would have been so much cheering and applause. There haven't really been questions. If anyone has a question, put it in. So much caps lock.
Yes. Yes. I love you all so much. Okay. If any questions come up, let me know. We are in the examples part, so maybe this is where all the questions will arise.
Oh, Diana just said, can you stand closer to your mic, please?
Is that better?
Sound is pretty. Is that better, Diana? A little.
A little. Let me hydrate a little bit here.
And perhaps this is where you're going, but Wade asks, any advice on how an astrologer can check unintended bias in their work?
Ooh, yes, I have some, yes. Before I get into the examples, I think one way that we can check unintended biases is to do a quick little inventory of our own identities, right? Just understanding where we are on that set of intersections of power and privilege and access. So one thing, like for myself, I said, I'm indigenous heritage. I'm red as black. That's also part of my heritage, but that's not part of my my family and my culture. I'm man identified, he, him, his. I'm trans, I'm queer. All of those things color the way that I view the world and also the amount of privilege that I have, right? So unintended biases. Well, I know I'm a man, so let me really be diligent. One thing that you could do if you have colleagues who are women who have the emotional capacity and consent to give you their time and labor and energy, you can dialogue with them and ask them. You can also look and see if the language that you're using includes all the pronouns, right? It's not that much extra work to use he, him, his, her, their, them, right? If we do gender the planets, note that. And note just like, hey, I think the planets, I anthropomorphize them. I think they're entities, they're sentient. I think they have gender. I think Mercury has no gender, but that is their gender. And I think that these other planets have gender. So just like, I guess there could be a set of, well, mostly I would say, yes, there is. It's a complicated conversation depending on how aware somebody is of these things. If this is really triggering for somebody, then I would suggest that you take it slowly and seek resources. I would also invite everybody who's here to share your resources. One thing that I'm working on, we'll get to at the end, is how to move this forward, bring more people and like formalize intersectional astrology as its own thing. But to answer your question kind of briefly, Wade, yes. And the place that it starts is just being aware of, one, the fact that we all are products of our culture. There is no way outside of that. And basically just assuming if I'm a man, I'm probably going to not know what a woman's experience is like. Ergo, I might not be knowledgeable. Ergo, I should include women in my practice. I should try to do an interview with females, like as much as possible. I think inclusion is the conclusion. And I think in a minute, I'm going to get to that slide. Does that, Wade, answer the question for now? Not in the chat box.
Yeah, Wade actually had a follow-up, but yeah. Perhaps we can push. There's a bunch of questions coming in, so we'll kind of, maybe you can do a bit more and we'll, because they're a bit more general.
Hey, I finally found how to get the dialogue box, the chat box open. Okay, yes, we will come back to that, and I think we will definitely have time for questions, maybe even 20 minutes.
Okay, and we're at that half-hour mark.
Beautiful, thank you. Okay, so one example of how we can apply intersectionality to our practice, a significations checklist. Do we have ground rules, structure, a container in our organization and our practice that allows for everybody, client, student, what have you, access to growth, opportunity, their education? Do we provide that growth, opportunity, and education in a way that allows everyone equal access to power, empowerment, efficacy of action? That's like the best way I could think to say it. Do we do it in a way that allows people's action to really have an impact? It's one thing to invite someone to dinner, but if you put them at the kiddies table, like way away from the food, and you don't give them utensils, it's a little hard for them to actually have efficacy of action, right? If what we're trying to do is help them eat. An agency, that's Mars, right? Venus, we could look at cooperation, inclusion, values. Are we doing that bonding, coalescing, drawing together thing? We're letting Venus's function really show through. And then Mercury, right? That's the astrologer. That's our astrology. It's our magic. It's our storytelling. Another way to think about that, do we have ground rules and structure that facilitate the opportunities for educational growth? They give people agency, empowerment, efficacy of action. Does our power analysis facilitate valuable inclusion and cooperation through our storytelling, magic, and astrology? And then, of course, we do have a sun and moon. I think that's the client. I think that's us. That's, if you were at my moon lecture last week with Wasa, if the sun is our conscious identification and the moon is our subconscious awareness, and are we really bringing those together, applying our astrology in a way that is inclusive to all of our clients' experiences, students' experiences? We can also look at Venus and Jupiter together, those two, the benefics. Are we letting the benefics really shine by giving access to everybody, like even average income earners or people who don't have a lot of financial access or power? Are the malefics constructively channeled, right? Do we have a structure for behavior that allows everyone to engage? I had those ground rules, assuming we'd be in person, thinking, what if there's somebody who's like really not cool with this and start to flip out? I gotta have some ground rules so that we can have a structure that allows everybody to engage safely. Jupiter and Saturn, right? We could get with the social planets, doing tangible learning objectives. I think we could go on and on. I don't think I did too much. So Mars, right? We're thinking about Mars as our efficacy of action. When we're looking at our clients' charts, we could ask, you know, with that Mars, that exalted Mars in Capricorn, with what degree of difficulty does that Mars have? Does that Mars find access to a field to act within that's functional, right? And then Jupiter, our ability to grow. Are we asking what avenues of expansion are actually available to our clients? Are we talking to a client who has no family members who've ever graduated from high school about advanced degrees? Are we being realistic about how that opportunity shows up and what's required to access that opportunity? Now, I included this for Kira. In my first lecture, I argued that the intersectionality of astrology is gonna happen no matter what, because millennials are gonna make it happen because of a few little demographic bits of data. This comes from Brookings Institute. This is from like 2018, but this is more or less still accurate. The largest living generation as of 2018, 2019, that's true of millennials in the US. About 2/5 of the workforce, like 40% of the workforce, right? The most diverse generation with the largest number of first and second generation immigrants since before World War II. We're super duper diverse. We also have the highest educational attainment within history, like within modern living generations. And this I find really interesting. I'm not going to dwell on it given our current circumstances. But about half of millennials were employed in the hospitality industry in 2018, making about $15 an hour. And given what has happened to the hospitality industry with the pandemic, I'm sure we can see how understanding these really matters. Now, half of millennials are not in hospitality. Some are in tech. Some have work from home jobs that are really cushy. Some are Mark Zuckerberg and very, very wealthy. But that's not all of us. And so even just looking at the mundane level, are we looking at the data in a way that includes everybody? Or are we making statements that everybody had this experience when a certain transit took place? It's okay to say that people generally had an experience when a transit took place, but it's important to mark that and note that that's from our limited, obviously biased perspective, right? One thing I think, Wade, to answer your question a little bit, is to note that we are always biased. Every human is biased. There is no way we can get through it. So if we find a moment where something rubs up against our experience, I can give this example. I was in Thailand, first time I'd ever left the States, except going through Canada, but Canada is so much like the States that as an American, you don't have this type of culture shock. Now, Thai culture suits my personality. It's like everyone's happy and chill and Buddhist also, so I was just like happy as a clam. As in Chiang Mai, there's a lot of Chinese tourists in Chiang Mai. I've been in China once, but not very familiar with Chinese culture. I found myself in a moment where there was a family down the hall in the hotel, and they were in multiple rooms yelling at each other through the hallway. And I'm just getting angry, like, how could people be so rude and so loud? And then I had this moment where I was like, why am I like assuming that being quiet is respectful? Interesting. I made a value judgment there. I wasn't just describing the situation, because it's 100% true. They were hollering up a storm at 11:30 at night. But it wasn't rude that they were doing it. It was loud that they were doing it. And so I did a little research about Chinese culture. I was like, is that a thing? Like, am I just super racist? Like, wow, I'm a racist asshole. Chinese people are loud. And I did a little research and read an article that said, you know, in certain cities in China, people are in such tight quarters that if you're an American, you might be really taken aback by the volume, because it's not our cultural framework. The point of the story is that I had an American racist moment because I'm an American, and like anybody with a culture, I assumed my cultural view was the correct one. And anything outside of my culture, anything outside of my comfort zone is wrong, rude, uncool, not just different and unfamiliar. I'd like to think that I have also given an example of a way that you can check your bias, like, hey, is that a cultural thing? Like, Thai people, one thing I found in my little tour guide book is that Thai folks laugh a lot, and they like it when you try stuff. And if you fail, they'll laugh because they're like, yay for you, you tried and you failed. It isn't life funny. They're not being mean to you. So that's one way we can check our bias, just to know when we have that hackle moment, it's probably because something is outside our perspective of what's normal and appropriate. Or maybe we leave people out of a discussion of who is affected by a transit because that's not our experience or frame. That's just normal human bias. On the millennial point, thinking about Maurice Fernandez's book on Neptune and Pisces in the 12th house, for those who are of the EA modern bent, he spoke about Neptune as a generational planet that speaks to the way that the place where, or the thing that a generation idealizes. So with Neptune and Pluto in a sextile for most of the 1900s, 20th century, most of us alive have those two planets in a sextile. I think millennials are mostly included in the sextile between Sag and Libra and the sextile between Scorpio and Capricorn. And that for the elder millennials amongst us, the obsession is this ideal that there should be relationships that are built in a way that expresses philosophical ideals around equality and fairness, the truth, what is right? Extreme Sag, extreme Libra. And for us slightly less elder, middle millennials, younger millennials, it's about transforming, right? Because Pluto wants to transform from this EA perspective, transforming the use of power, Capricorn, the structured use of power, Capricorn and Scorpio, in order to create like a perfect social institution, right? This idealized Neptune in Capricorn. So I said in 2018, it's no surprise that millennials are obsessed with relationships and power dynamics. And it's no surprise that with intersectionality coming up in '89, a big year for millennials, that we would take that intersectionality banner and really take it all over the place. So my conclusion is that inclusion is the conclusion. If oppression is systematic disenfranchisement, then the opposite of that is systematic inclusion, right? And I think that's where intersectional astrology has a lot of power, and where we as astrologers have a lot of opportunity to do good for our clients and the world. So inclusion, belonging, collective liberation. I made this as a slide, and I'm citing here an interview that Daniel Bernal and Drew Levanti did on Daniel's YouTube channel. Daniel Bernal is his YouTube channel. You want to check out the show Queer Skies that he hosts there, podcast. They interviewed Michael J. Moritz, and the three of them discussed feminist theory, queer theory, and cross-pollination with astrology. This episode is so important to what I'm speaking about today that it would do injustice to this talk, and it would be an example of being out of alignment with the praxis of intersectionality if I didn't cite them. It was something that Michael said about legibility of identity that really pulled all these pieces together for me. I've been thinking about astrology as a discipline and where the various schools of thought fit, how consultations work, politics. Go back so I can talk about Diana separately. But it was this thought about legibility of identity that pulled it all together. And I thought to myself, if our significations only talk about preeminence and awesome things, we're talking about a position of like social supremacy or dominance. We're not talking about the vast array of experiences that people who are oppressed or marginalized are experiencing. And how do we speak to clients in a way that makes their identity legible, right? Clear. If my handwriting is illegible, which it is, then you can't understand what I'm attempting to communicate. Now, if our identities are illegible in society, I'm doing justice to what Michael said here. The issue of legibility in society is actually an issue of life and death. If you're not legible in your society, right, just like Crenshaw's article, if you're not legible in your society, if you're not included in the domain of who is normal and protected, you lose a fundamental access to your humanity, your human dignity, civil liberties, depending on what we're talking about. So in the consultation room, in our organizations, if we're practicing our astrology in a way that speaks to everyone's experiences, we can create more inclusion in our organizations, in the consultation room, by making identity more legible. Believe that that helps to give our clients an increased sense of belonging. And that when people have a sense of belonging, that's the step that you need to get into like the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. As problematic as that can be in some ways. You need that sense of belonging to really achieve the self-actualization. If you don't have belonging, just as a mammal, you lack a fundamental sense of safety that's necessary to thrive. Now, on the note of inclusion, belonging, and collective liberation, Diana Rose Harper is another astrologer who I think is doing this really important work. For those of you who were at her talk on Friday, Diana spoke about fierce compassion, natal astrology as a tool for radical self-care. Now, when we bring that radical self-care, that's something that many great intersectional thinkers, feminists, anti-racist activists have spoken to. That self-care is not some trifling self-indulgence. Self-care is actually a very powerful political tool, or for trying to dismantle these systems of oppression, it's a powerful political weapon. Self-care is a necessary prerequisite to experience the type of love that Bell Hooks spoke about. Showing up, to paraphrase very loosely, to show up for another person, to care about them and prioritize them in your actions in such a way that you facilitate their well-being, their psychological, spiritual development and growth. Very loosely, all about love, Bell Hooks. So here's another way to look at it. If we've got this spectrum where on one side, we've got total domination, supremacy, fascism, put a lot of different words over there with our malefic friends. On the other side, we have collective liberation. This is the trad chad style. So we just have the 7 traditional planets. In the middle, we have Mercury, our symbol for astrology, and the astrologer, and then that consciousness. When the astrologer comes together and we're conscious of the fact that we live in a society, a world that has many systems of oppression, we can then consciously seek to transmit our astrology in a way that seeks a collective liberation. For you folks who are modern, put Uranus in the middle, add Neptune over with the benefics, right? Because we're getting real collective with it, and add Pluto into the total domination. Get the same idea. Legibility of identity. I thought I had my slides wrong, or my thoughts wrong. So I think I already spoke to how these ideas fit together. If we're really, really conscious of identity as it relates to the way that our clients experience the world, the midheaven, how it affects their reputation, how they're seen, how they're coded, the ascendant and descendant axis, and I thought I had something in there about the way that our relationships are defined by our experiences of power in the world. And then our home life in the way that it shapes us psychologically and physiologically in our early childhood shows up in the nadir. Marina Tudor is another great example of an astrologer who is working in an intersectional and radical way with astrology to bring more legibility of identity with their research into gender fabulous. I think that's the coolest word to encompass all the different types of queer, trans, non-binary, intersex folks. By actually doing the research, we then have the valid data, something that some of us were in dialogue about over the weekend. We have to do the research if we're going to be able to see it in the chart, at least if we're going to be able to do it in a way where we can teach how to see a person's positionality in their chart. Now, praxis as practice. I know that there was an actual person who coined this term, and it wasn't Ari Felix, but it was Ari Felix who first said those words to me. We had a Zoom call that Ari actually organized. I'm citing this because I think they are an example of praxis as practice. So praxis, right? It's an embodied way of working with, demonstrating knowledge, the theory, right? So if praxis is our practice, then we would use our intersectional heuristic to analyze class, race, gender, how it's affecting our client, and we will engage in embodied practice towards creating more inclusion and collective liberation and belonging. One way that I've seen an astrologer do that recently is Ari Felix, who organized a Zoom call for a bunch of folks who were of a similar set of thinking. And it wasn't just that they organized this call and they used a resource that they have to allow everybody to access connection and belonging. It's that they actually held the space of facilitating the conversation. And sometimes it's just as simple as facilitating a conversation, naming the thing that's there. It's not about fixing it right away, right? That's kind of a, as Michael mentioned, that Angela Davis discussed, it's kind of capitalist way of looking at time. That we could just identify what we want and then just, boom, in the amount of time that I'd like, make it happen. But when we embody, right, we bring this praxis into our practices in an embodied way, we can really help to bring more legibility and belonging. In the astrological community, Kira Taborn is a person who's been doing that. You might also know her as Shakira. Her magazine Influx, which is on hiatus at the moment, is a magazine, right? Kira is a person who used her platform to highlight and center the voices of women of color, people of color, queer folks, right? And brought that to the astrological community. I'm sure that we'll be seeing a lot more of Kira's intersectional work, right? That's on the publishing side of things. So there's so many different ways. Is it research? Is it publishing? Is it education? Erin Tack Shipley is another astrologer out there who's doing the intersectional work. She is very specifically a white astrologer who's bringing anti-racism into her astrological practice. So that's another hands-up, like tangible resource. I think, Wade, you asked, for those of us who want to check our unconscious or unknown biases, particularly if you're a white person who wants to explore how to be an anti-racist ally or accomplice in your work, hit up Erin. She's got a lot of really fantastic information and is an amazing asset to our community. Okay, so I did it. I think I made some amount of time for questions and answers. If anybody has anything, I'm going to flip back to a slide I wanted to speak a little bit more about. Otherwise, Palace, if you could.
You absolutely did. Yeah, we've got about 12 minutes left. I have a couple good questions here. I mean, there's going to be many good questions, I think. Kelsey Pasha asks, how can we bring intersectional analysis to all charts rather than only interrogating, reconsidering placements in charts based on what we know about the client's experience of oppression? Where is the line where we question something like the effectiveness of an exalted Mars without tokenizing the person or assuming they may not have power access to the ability to express themselves in their chart?
Yeah. So that's consulting skills, counseling skills, whatever you want to call it. Right, I wouldn't bring up that exalted Mars sexism situation if that hadn't already been brought up. But then I think so. I've heard there was an article that I want to say it was Barry Perlman wrote for the Mountain Astrologer maybe several years ago about queer astrology. And his position is that you can't see queerness in the chart, and I think that's true and untrue. You cannot see queerness in the chart. You can't just grab a chart and be like, aha, this is the chart of a homosexual. Totally doesn't work like that. But if you're talking to your client and he talks about this boy that he's really interested in, then maybe you start looking in the chart and going, ooh, instead of going, this is a man, so Venus is women in his life, maybe you go, ooh, this is a gay guy. So maybe Venus is like what he's attracted to and the men he's attracted to, right? It's not something in the same way that you can't tell if a chart is Baghdad or a dog or a human or the future unless you're really paying attention to the date, right? The configuration of the planets is not what gives us all of the meaning in the chart, and that's true of any aspect of being a human. That's what I'll say in the short version, but I'm happy to talk more about that.
Yeah. Taylor asks, what is the current state of intersectional astrology? Is there an organization? I have background in cross-cultural regenerative organizations and communications and professional DEI work. How can I get involved in a more formalized way? Okay,
so Kira, I can see your face, and Erin, I can see your face right now. Should I tell people about it in this very public way? I see one thumbs up. Erin's just looking at me. Where's Diana? Diana, thumbs up, yes. Okay, so last year at NORWAC, Diana, Rose Harper, Kira, and I met for the first time. Erin and I were connected by Kay Taylor. The four of us have been in discussion about the organization. Right now we're calling MICA, the metaphysical intersection. The metaphysical, I can't right now. someone please type it in the box and help me. We started a group called MICA, and that's an acronym for something that my brain can't remember. Yes, we are starting a very young organization. If NORWAC were in person, there would be about a dozen of us having a kind of like a founders retreat to talk about how we want to move the movement forward. I'll include my email address at the end, whether you're interested in participating, whether you want to check my astrology, engage in some academic debate about per discipline. If for whatever reason you have, please just contact me and I will get people in touch. And yes, if you would like to see an organization, I believe that there is an upswelling right now, and that it's happening very soon.
Much going on in the chat right now. To find out more, Nate wants to know how to throw money at you, at the organization.
Yes, talk to us more. You can DM me. We'll talk more about it. Yes, Kira's putting stuff in the chat box. Diana put stuff in the chat box. We're gonna have to like make a website and do stuff now. But yes, just get in touch with us. We would love to have all of you participate in whatever way feels best.
So we're at the 8-minute mark as a note. Camille has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Camille Michelle Gray. As a POC client seeking guidance from another astrologer, how do you speak up for yourself when you sense your humanity isn't being wholly considered? It can be awkward and frustrating if the astrologer isn't coming from that mindset. Speaking from experience, curious about how to hold on to agency without making the practitioner feel bad or weird. Scare quotes around bad and weird.
That is a fantastic question that I do not have an answer to in this moment. I think that in the near to slightly less near future, there will be some sort of resource for people who are seeking astrologers to find astrologers who are trauma-informed, intersectionality informed, and similar. I would say in the meantime, to anybody who is looking in the moment, if you feel comfortable, speak to whatever statement doesn't grok with your experience. Like, hey, am I really where I'm supposed to be? Like, I thought my boss was being a sexist asshole, or I thought that was really racist. That's a really tricky conversation as a Buddhist person. The question of karma and just desserts, if you're looking at astrology from like a multi-lifetime perspective, is so sticky. If we were having NORWAC in person, we would all be up, I'm sure, until the wee hours talking about that. I would say, in the moment, do what you can to talk to them. If they're part of an organization and you don't feel comfortable addressing them directly, you could think about reaching out to that organization and seeing if they have a process for repair or redress. And in the meantime, I would say if you're seeking an astrologer, look for an astrologer who is a member of, or ideally certified by, an organization. Obviously, there's some access stuff there to talk about. But in my experience, astrologers who are actively engaged with astrological organizations tend to have the type of counseling skills where if that were to arise, they would, I would think, would be a little more able to respond to that in a way that is generative for the client.
You're amazing. You're getting lots of echoes in the chat here. Liz asks, how could one go about addressing the struggle of identity with folks who are coming from a place of intersectional marginalization on multiple fronts in a consulting situation? Liz uses the example of identifying as gender fluid Indigenous while being historically cut off from said Indigenousness due to the nature of colonialism, white supremacy, and being seen as white passing, gendered strictly in the binary, thus having identity erased by society.
As an Indigenous person who is not perceived as Indigenous and who is gender fabulous and doesn't have access to my Indigenous culture to understand that in a culturally appropriate framework, I feel you. I totally don't have an answer to that question. I would say to any astrologer who seeks to apply intersectionality, the first place to start is simply understanding where you exist on the intersection and being willing to speak to your client's positionality. I think the next step is then getting more informed. That's going to mean some self-education. I think for white folks, that means working with folks like Aaron, other anti-racist white allies who are doing that work, because you need another white person to move you through that process. In the same way that it's really important for anybody who has a marginalized identity or a privileged identity to come together with folks who understand their experience. I think when it comes to gender stuff, there are astrologers out there like Arthur Leponowitz. Last names, please come to my brain. There are many, Arena Tudor, who I also already mentioned. There are astrologers out there who are sensitive to that and willing to explore that question. But in the same way that we can't know, is Jupiter your teacher, your uncle, your priest, something else that is your bartender trying to get you all boozed up? We don't know who Jupiter is till we talk to you. We can't know how any of those things show up until we start that dialogue with a client. I super duper recommend that any astrologers who want to apply these skills get linked up with an organization that teaches counseling skills or mentoring with an experienced astrologer who can help you kind of figure out the right way to work that into your practice, because it's going to vary depending on your own experience and position.
Brilliant. Iris is asking if you have interest in Chiron through an intersection lens, the wounded healer, regarding how many marginalized peoples are healers that learn from institutional personal violence to offer compassion and love to their community.
Yeah, I think Chiron can definitely symbolize for folks who are marginalized. Like in the sessions that I do that are a bit more EA focused, or kind of lean that direction based on the client, I've found a lot of times Chiron is somebody who had a lot of trauma or pain or difficulty with some aspect of their identity, and it was in grappling with that part of their identity that they developed the skills that they then are able to use as a teacher. I believe, I don't want to speak too much because I haven't asked for consent to do this, but I think there's an astrologer in this room who wrote a memoir that kind of speaks to that process themselves. Yes, their video is on. If you know who I'm talking about, you will see them in here. I hope that answers that question. It's all kind of hard to get super duper into the specifics, because again, if there is a way to see the details of marginalization through a series of significations, that research isn't done yet. I am starting it, and I implore all of you to please come participate with me. And I think that is a bigger question. I think not all schools of astrological thought actually have a philosophy that says we would be able to see those things. So it's going to be really dependent.
We've just got a couple minutes left. I think we covered the majority of the questions that were sent to me. Camila, has someone saved this chat? I assume you're saving this chat on your end there.
I just saved it right now. I'll try to remember to save it before we close it down.
As you should. The comments are amazing.
I'm trying to follow, and I will read it afterwards. So one last thing I want to say. Oh, go back. This little bit. This was my thought process. It's a working process. But here's one way where I think we might be able to start taking different significations. So I have here some exaltations and some joys. If we think about the sun rejoicing in the ninth house as being related to counsel, divination, astrology, right? You can see some of those things in the traditional material. If we think about the moon rejoicing in the third house, and that third house having to do with our early childhood environment, the things that are familiar to us, the moon stuff, right? Then that's one way where we might start anchoring in. That's just a different way we might think about the sun in someone's chart, the ninth house in someone's chart. I mentioned the example very specifically of Mars exalting in Capricorn because I have seen that in a real person's chart. But I think we can also see, like, are we getting super descriptive about actionable memos? Elder millennials, you will know that phrase. And many other generation people too. Are we getting really like deeply symbolic and mergy in a collective unconscious, subconscious kind of realm? And then I think the one that I'm most certain about is that we could take Jupiter's exaltation in Cancer to be belonging, right? So if we think about how can we bring a Jupiterian experience of Cancerian qualities to our client, can we give them a big, expansive sense of belonging, connection, nurturing, and care? And then Saturn's exaltation in Libra, I've been thinking a lot lately about as whether or not you're marginalized, normative. Are you within the bounds of who has protection under the law, who is considered normal, who is considered right and appropriate as you are. If Saturn in Libra is not your friend, you're probably definitely marginalized. So that's just one way I think we can start to explore this. But as I said, this is in some ways very new, the idea of taking these things together in this way. And in other ways, it's very much not. And there are many astrologers who've been doing this work well before me. I'm going to really quickly click through to try to get towards the end so I can show you my slides, name the correct people so you can see their contact info. If you want the slides, please let me know. I'm happy to email them to you. Laura has them as well. So Daniel Bernal, Diana Rose Harper, Ari Felix, Peter Labonte, Michael J. Morris, Aaron T. Shipley, Kira Tavon, Rena Tudor. I want to thank you all for letting me share your work in this presentation. And I want to encourage everybody who's watching or listening to get in touch with them, check out their work, engage them as practitioners. They're all phenomenal human beings with a lot to offer our community. And then I want to just leave you all with the question, what else becomes possible when you engage intersectional astrology? Same question you've been asking me. And then there's all my contact information. I'm Bear Ryver. Psyche and Soul Astrology is the name of my practice. PsycheandSoulAstrology.com is where you can find my work. And you can email me at bear, spelled like the animal, at PsycheandSoulAstrology.com. Thank you all very much for your time. I'm happy to keep chatting with you and chat with you in the room afterwards.
That was incredible. Thank you, Bear. Yeah, Gregory is, great.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Bear. That was astounding, my friend. That was awesome. So I'm going to close the lecture down, everybody, and then reopen the room again, and you're all more than welcome to come back and continue this fabulous conversation. Thank you all for coming, and I'll be with you in just a second.